Let me be direct about what is unfolding in Crimea right now, because the significance of these developments extends well beyond what most analysts are currently discussing. Russian military commanders are leaving the peninsula, not in organized rotation, not on scheduled redeployment orders from Moscow. They are leaving ahead of orders, moving their families, surrendering housing and personal property they cannot transport, and establishing themselves in Novorossiysk before the situation forces them out under worse conditions. That distinction matters enormously. When professional military officers abandon a command position without authorization, it is not a logistical event. It is a judgment rendered by the people who have the most complete picture of conditions on the ground. These commanders understand something about the viability of Crimea as a defensible military position that neither the Kremlin's public statements nor Moscow's operational orders currently reflect. And what they understand has driven them to act unilaterally, regardless of the political consequences. That is the starting point for this analysis, and everything that follows flows from it. To understand the full weight of what this departure represents, you need to understand what Crimea was supposed to be. After the 2014 annexation, Vladimir Putin did not simply occupy the peninsula and move on. He invested in it deliberately, systematically, and at enormous cost over the better part of a decade. The investment was both military and political, and the two were inseparable. Militarily, Crimea became the cornerstone of Russia's Black Sea strategy. Hundreds of air defense systems were in place. Iskander ballistic missile batteries were positioned to hold at risk NATO assets across a broad arc of southeastern Europe. Caliber cruise missile platforms were forward deployed. The Black Sea Fleet, already headquartered in Sevastopol under a pre annexation basing agreement, was reinforced, expanded, and repositioned as the primary instrument of Russian maritime power projection in the region. Crimea became what military planners call an anti access and area denial complex, a layered system of weapons, sensors, and command infrastructure designed to deny an adversary freedom of movement within a defined operational zone. For years, that system functioned as designed. It constrained Ukrainian military options, complicated NATO planning, and gave Russia a commanding position over the northern Black Sea littoral. The Kremlin's narrative built around this reality was not entirely wrong. Crimea was, in fact, a fortress. But a fortress is only as strong as its logistics, its communications, and its command integrity. Strip away any one of those three pillars, and the physical fortifications become liabilities rather than assets. They fix forces in place, they consume resources, they create a garrison mentality that, under sufficient pressure, collapses faster than an open defensive line because there is no room to maneuver, no option to withdraw to a more defensible position, and no flexibility for commanders to adapt to a changing operational environment. What Ukraine has accomplished over the past several years, and with accelerating effectiveness in 2025 and 2026, is the systematic destruction of all three pillars simultaneously. The result is not a fortress under siege. It is a fortress in the process of becoming a trap, and the officers with the clearest understanding of that reality are now voting with their feet. The sequence of events leading to this moment did not begin overnight. It began in April 2022 with the sinking of the Moskva, the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, by Ukrainian Neptune missiles. That single strike was more than a tactical loss. It was a strategic signal. It demonstrated that Russian naval assets in the Black Sea were operating within the effective range of Ukrainian precision strike systems, and that the air defense umbrella over those assets had a ceiling that Ukrainian planners had identified and could exploit. The perception of invulnerability that had surrounded Russian Black Sea operations since 2014 cracked in a single engagement. What followed was not a recovery, it was a managed retreat dressed in the language of repositioning. Ships that had operated freely in the Western Black Sea began withdrawing eastward. Fleet activities that had been conducted openly became increasingly constrained. And the command structure responsible for those activities began the long process of recognizing that Sevastopol, for all its historical and political significance, was no longer a safe operating environment for high value naval assets. By 2023, Ukrainian Storm Shadow missiles had demonstrated the capacity to reach hardened command infrastructure inside Crimea with precision and lethality that Russian air defenses could not consistently intercept. The September 2023 strike on the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol killed senior officers and destroyed critical command infrastructure. It was not a lucky hit. It was the product of a deliberate Ukrainian intelligence and strike campaign that had been building targeting data for months. That campaign continued in 2024 with systematic strikes on individual fleet vessels, air defense batteries, and logistics nodes. Each strike was calculated not merely to destroy a specific target, but to degrade the integrated system of systems that made Crimea functional as a military base. By the end of 2024, the majority of Black Sea Fleet surface combatants had been withdrawn to Novorossiysk, outside the operational range of most Ukrainian strike systems available at that time. The withdrawal was presented publicly as a routine adjustment. Any professional military observer understood it for what it was: a forced repositioning driven by unsustainable losses and an inability to protect high value assets in their primary operating area. What 2025 and the first half of 2026 have added to this picture is the destruction of the command and logistics infrastructure that allowed Russian ground forces to operate on the peninsula independent of the naval situation. In February 2026, the Black Sea Fleet's historic main headquarters building in Sevastopol, a structure that had survived the Second World War and stood for more than a century as a symbol of Russian military presence in the region, was demolished by Russian crews. That is a significant detail worth pausing on. Russian engineers did not demolish that building because they chose to. They demolished it because Storm Shadow missile strikes had rendered it structurally irreparable. The decision to bring down that building rather than repair it was an admission that the strikes had been effective beyond what Russian engineers could correct, and that the infrastructure investment required to restore it was not justified given the continued threat environment. It was, in effect, a written acknowledgement that Ukrainian precision strike operations had permanently altered the operational landscape of Sevastopol. The triggering event for the current command flight came on May 27th of this year. Ukrainian Storm Shadow missiles struck the Aviation General Headquarters on Goal Street in Sevastopol, destroying hardened communications infrastructure that had been the backbone of Crimean operational coordination. According to multiple independent sources, the strike did not merely damage physical structures, it destroyed the hardened communications nodes that linked command elements across the peninsula, degraded the real-time coordination capacity between air defense batteries and early warning systems, and caused the loss of documents and operational materials that cannot be quickly reconstituted. Within days of that strike, officers began organizing their personal departures. They did not wait for orders from Moscow. They assessed the situation with the professional judgment that comes from years of operational experience, reached conclusions that the Kremlin's public posture was not prepared to acknowledge, and began acting on those conclusions. That is the environment we are analyzing today. The operational consequences of this command departure are not abstract. They are concrete, immediate, and cascading. The first and most direct consequence is the disruption of real-time command and control across all Crimean military formations. A command structure does not function as a collection of individual officers who can be replaced or relocated without effect. It is an integrated system of relationships, procedures, communication protocols, and institutional knowledge that has been built over years of operation in a specific environment. When that system is physically displaced, when the officers who maintain it pack their families and move 300 kilometers away across a contested strait, the system does not move with them intact. It fragments. Subordinate commanders who have been accustomed to operating within a defined command relationship suddenly find themselves in an authority vacuum. Decisions that previously moved through established channels now encounter uncertainty at every level. Units that have been operating under a coherent command architecture find themselves making independent judgments for which their training and authority were not designed. For air defense operations specifically, this disruption is particularly consequential. Crimea's air defense network is not a collection of independent batteries operating autonomously. It is an integrated system in which individual S-400 platforms, radar sites, and electronic warfare assets share data in real time, coordinate engagement decisions through a central command node, and depend on that node for the deconfliction that prevents fratricide and ensures coherent coverage. When the command node is destroyed or displaced, the network degrades from an integrated system to a collection of isolated platforms. Each platform can still function individually, but the collective effectiveness of the network, the overlapping coverage, the coordinated engagement sequencing, the ability to handle saturation attacks declines sharply. Ukraine's strike planners understand this dynamic. They have been systematically targeting command and communications nodes precisely because they understand that destroying the connective tissue of the network is more effective than destroying individual platforms. The May 27th strike was not an attack on a building, it was an attack on the nervous system of Crimea's defensive architecture. The logistics situation compounds every one of these operational problems, and this is where the strategic picture becomes truly dire for Russian forces on the peninsula. Crimea is not self-sufficient. It never has been. The peninsula's agricultural capacity cannot sustain its current population, which has grown significantly since 2014 through deliberate Russian resettlement programs. Its industrial base is limited. Its energy infrastructure, while augmented since annexation, remains dependent on connections to the mainland. Everything that Russian military forces on the peninsula consume, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, has to arrive via one of four routes, and Ukraine has been methodically degrading each of those routes in sequence. The Kerch Bridge, the most significant logistics artery connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland, has been struck repeatedly throughout the conflict and has sustained damage that has progressively limited its capacity. Transit of fuel tankers and dangerous cargo is currently prohibited. Traffic is regularly interrupted by security procedures that can delay convoys for hours. The bridge that Putin personally inaugurated as a symbol of Crimea's permanent integration into Russia is now a logistics bottleneck operating below capacity and under continuous threat. The maritime route, which should theoretically provide an alternative, has been rendered extraordinarily dangerous by Ukraine's naval drone campaign. The last major ferry vessel operating the Kerch Strait route was sunk in April by Ukrainian forces. Remaining small craft have limited capacity and operate under constant threat from naval drones that now effectively patrol the strait. What was once a secondary logistics line has become an extremely high-risk operation capable of moving only a fraction of the supply volume that Crimean forces require. The land corridor through occupied southern Ukraine, the route running through Melitopol, Mariupol, and Rostov, has been disrupted by both Ukrainian strike operations and Russian restrictions on military cargo transit that reflect Moscow's own assessment of the vulnerability of that route. Independent analysts report that vehicle crossings on that corridor have dropped by more than 70%. Convoys that do use the route are forced to move at night in small dispersed groups to reduce their signature. But Ukrainian thermal imaging drone systems have demonstrated the ability to identify and engage vehicle convoys in darkness. There is no safe route. There is only a range of dangerous options with different risk profiles, and the aggregate supply reaching Crimea across all of them is declining. The fuel crisis that has already materialized on the peninsula is an early indicator of where this trajectory leads. On June 7th, Ukrainian strikes destroyed Crimea's two largest fuel storage facilities. The distribution system collapsed, a rationing mechanism was activated, and then abandoned because there was no fuel to ration. Russian-appointed officials publicly acknowledged that resupply vehicles cannot reach the peninsula. The Russian Energy Ministry confirmed that drone attacks caused the crisis. This is not a temporary disruption that normal military logistics can absorb and correct. It is a structural failure of the supply chain serving an isolated military garrison. and it is happening simultaneously with the food supply disruptions that are already producing shortages of basic staples across the occupied peninsula. These are not independent problems. They are symptoms of the same underlying condition. Crimea is being systematically isolated, and the isolation is becoming total. But here is what makes the next phase of this analysis so important, and why you need to stay with me through what comes next. The question of what Russia can actually do in response to this deteriorating situation. Whether Moscow has the capacity to stabilize Crimea, reinforce it, or find some alternative strategic arrangement is not simply a question about Crimea. It is a question about the overall state of Russian military capacity across every front of this war simultaneously. And the answer to that question reveals a strategic dilemma of a severity that the Kremlin has not yet publicly acknowledged and may not be capable of resolving. The garrison left behind in Crimea, estimated at tens of thousands of soldiers, is not simply waiting for relief that is delayed. They may be waiting for relief that cannot come, for reasons that extend far beyond the peninsula itself. And understanding why that is the case requires us to look at the entire front picture, north, east, and south, and understand what Russia actually has available to send. That analysis begins now, and what it reveals about Russia's strategic position will fundamentally change how you understand the trajectory of this war. To understand whether Russia can rescue its position in Crimea, you have to step back from the peninsula itself and look at the complete operational picture across every active front. Because military capacity is not unlimited, and every soldier, every artillery round, every command asset committed to one sector of a front is a soldier, a round, and a command asset unavailable everywhere else. That is the fundamental constraint of land warfare, and it is a constraint that the Russian military is now confronting with a severity that has no clean solution. The Institute for the Study of War's assessment from March of this year made the situation explicit. At that point, Russia was not moving additional forces into Crimea. It was doing the opposite. It was drawing forces out of the Crimean garrison and sending them to plugging gaps on other fronts where casualty rates had created manpower shortfalls that could not be addressed any other way. The 810th Naval Infantry Brigade was redirected to the Kursk direction. The 55th and 120th Naval Infantry Divisions were transferred to reinforce the 29th Army's sector on the Zaporizhzhia front. These were not token transfers. These were major formations drawn from a garrison that was already being asked to hold a peninsula under increasing pressure. The soldiers who remain in Crimea today are holding a position that has already been stripped of some of its most capable combat formations, with degraded logistics, degraded communications, and a command structure that is now physically relocating to the opposite side of the Kerch Strait. Look at the northern axis first. The situation around Kupiansk has deteriorated to the point where Russian forces have transitioned to a defensive posture in the Kharkiv direction. That is not a posture that generates spare capacity. A force on the defensive in a contested sector requires continuous reinforcement simply to maintain its position. Any reduction of forces in that sector to free up units for redeployment to Crimea creates an immediate vulnerability that Ukrainian planners would identify and exploit within days. The northern axis cannot contribute forces to Crimea without accepting a risk of operational collapse in its own sector that Moscow is not prepared to accept. Look at the eastern axis next. Russian forces have been committed in strength against the Ukrainian defensive belt in the Donetsk direction for the better part of 6 months, and the results have been deeply unfavorable relative to the casualties sustained. 60,000 soldiers by multiple independent estimates have been committed to operations in front of a fortified defensive line that has not been broken. The cost in personnel and equipment of those sustained offensive operations has been substantial, and the tactical gains achieved have not been proportionate to the investment. A force that is absorbing losses at that rate while attempting to sustain offensive operations cannot simultaneously generate a relief force for a secondary theater. Redirecting forces from the eastern axis to Crimea does not solve the Crimea problem. It creates an eastern axis problem on top of it, and the combined effect weakens the overall Russian strategic position faster than either problem individually. The southern axis presents the most immediate illustration of Russian capacity constraints. The 58th Combined Arms Army, which has been the primary Russian formation in the southern operational sector, has sustained casualties that multiple independent analysts assess at more than 20,000 personnel over the course of the current phase of operations. Ukrainian pressure in that sector has compressed the land corridor connecting Russian occupied southern Ukraine to a width of approximately 40 kilometers, narrow enough that Ukrainian fires can interdict movement across its entire breadth under the right conditions. The 58th Army is not available to reinforce Crimea. It is fighting to maintain its own coherence in a sector where the ground situation has deteriorated to the point that even defensive operations are demanding everything the formation has available. Asking that army to generate a relief force for the peninsula while simultaneously holding its own sector is not a realistic operational option. And running across all of these front sectors is the persistent constraint imposed by the continued requirement to maintain forces oriented toward Belarus and the northern approaches to Ukraine. Russian planners cannot ignore the possibility of escalation in that direction, which means forces must remain positioned to address it regardless of the pressure being generated everywhere else. Every front is simultaneously under stress. Every front is simultaneously consuming the resources that would theoretically be available to stabilize Crimea. The arithmetic is unforgiving, and it produces a conclusion that Russian operational planners have almost certainly already reached privately, even if the Kremlin's public posture has not yet caught up with that reality. There are no available reserves to send to Crimea in the numbers that would be required to meaningfully stabilize the situation there. But even if the manpower were available, the logistics reality would confront any reinforcement effort with the same set of obstacles that are already strangling the existing garrison. Sending additional forces to a peninsula with degraded access routes does not solve the logistics problem, it deepens it. More personnel require more food, more fuel, more ammunition, more medical support. If the supply chain cannot adequately sustain the forces already present, adding formations to the garrison increases the total demand on a supply chain that is already failing. This is not a theoretical concern. It is a practical military reality that has played out in besieged garrisons throughout the history of warfare. A garrison that cannot be adequately supplied does not become more viable by becoming larger. It becomes a larger problem, consuming more resources in pursuit of an outcome that the logistics situation has already made unachievable. This brings us to the most consequential strategic dimension of the Crimea situation, the one that distinguishes it from every other operational problem Russia has faced in this war. In the autumn of 2022, when Ukrainian forces recaptured the right bank of the Dnipro in Kherson Oblast, and Russian forces faced a deteriorating position on the opposite bank, Moscow made a difficult but strategically rational decision. It withdrew its forces across the river in an organized fashion, established a new defensive line on the left bank, and accepted the political cost of yielding Kherson City in exchange for preserving the combat effectiveness of the formations involved. That decision was painful. It was presented domestically with considerable effort to minimize its significance, but it was fundamentally a sound military judgment that preserved Russian capacity for subsequent operations. The option to make an equivalent judgment about Crimea does not exist, and that asymmetry is the core of the strategic dilemma Moscow now faces. Crimea is not Kherson. Kherson was a city on the right bank of a major river that could be yielded while maintaining a defensible position on the opposite bank. Crimea is a peninsula that Putin personally annexed, personally invested in as a symbol of Russian power and historical identity, and personally embedded into the constitutional and legal structure of the Russian Federation through a process designed to make the annexation appear irreversible. The political and personal cost of a Russian withdrawal from Crimea is of a categorically different order than the cost of the Kherson withdrawal. It would not be presented domestically or internationally as a tactical repositioning. It would be understood immediately and universally as the definitive failure of the central project of Putin's third presidential term.